There is a very expensive difference between thinking you own the land and knowing you own the land, and the HOA board was about to learn that lesson the hard way. They assumed that just because my backyard fence was set back 10 feet from the tree line, the extra land belonged to the community common area. So they decided to pave it over for a walking trail without asking. I tried to tell them, I tried to show them the maps, but they threatened me with fines for obstructing community improvement. So I sat back, brewed a pot of coffee, and let them pour the concrete. Because in the world of property law, the more they build, the more it hurts when they have to tear it down. If you enjoy stories about arrogant boards getting hit with the heavy hammer of the law, stick around. This is going to be a satisfying demolition. The sound wasn't a knock at the door. It was a vibration that rattled the teaspoons in the drying rack. Arthur Vance stood in his kitchen, gripping a mug of black coffee, watching ripples form in the dark liquid. It was 7:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. He had just returned late last night from 3 weeks in the Smoky Mountains, looking forward to the silence of his suburban cul-de-sac. Instead, the world outside sounded like a diesel-fueled war zone. He set the mug down on the granite counter, carefully, precisely, and walked to the sliding glass back door. His property, located in the violently average subdivision of Oak Creek, was prized for exactly one reason: the buffer, a thick, 30-foot strip of mature white oaks and dense underbrush separated his backyard from the communal retention pond area. It was the reason he had bought the house. It was a green wall of privacy, or it had been. Arthur slid the door open and stepped onto his patio. The air smelled of wet earth, exhaust, and pine sap. Where the dense tree line used to be, a bright yellow Caterpillar skid steer was currently ripping a 5-inch caliper sapling out of the ground. The machine reversed, beeping incessantly, its tracks churning the soft loam into a muddy slurry. Arthur didn't yell. He didn't run out waving his arms. He simply tightened the belt of his robe, stepped into his slippers, and walked down the lawn. There was a chain-link fence separating his manicured grass from the woods. It was an old fence installed by the previous owner, Mr. Henderson, to keep his golden retrievers from wandering into the woods. But Arthur knew something the Homeowners Association apparently didn't. Fences aren't property lines of things. Fences are just convenience. Standing near the skid steer, holding a clipboard and wearing a pristine neon yellow vest that looked like it had never seen a speck of dust, was Brenda Miller. Brenda was the new HOA president. She was a woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws like holy scripture, provided she was the one interpreting the verses. She was currently pointing aggressively at a stump, shouting over the engine noise to the operator. Arthur walked to the fence line. "Brenda," he said, his voice projecting well despite the noise, a trick learned from decades on loud construction sites. She didn't hear him. The skid steer roared, dropping the sapling onto a pile of debris that used to be Arthur's privacy screen. "Brenda!" Arthur barked, sharper this time. She turned, startled, adjusting her oversized sunglasses. When she saw it was Arthur, her expression shifted from surprise to a practiced, condescending smile. She waved a hand, signaling the operator to idle the machine. "Arthur, you're back," she called out, walking over to the other side of the chain-link fence. "We didn't expect you for another few days. Isn't it exciting? Phase 1 of the Zen Path is finally underway." Arthur looked at the destruction. "The Zen Path?" "The community walking trail," she corrected herself, beaming. "The board voted on it last month while you were away. We're putting in a paved nature walk and a meditation pergola right here near the pond. It's going to raise property values beautifully." Arthur looked at the skid steer, then down at the ground. He did the mental geometry instantly. The machine was currently sitting about 12 feet beyond his fence. "Brenda," Arthur said, his voice low and steady, "you are digging on my land." Brenda laughed. It was a light, dismissive sound, like wind chimes in a gale. "Oh, Arthur, don't be silly. This is the common area, see?" She gestured to his fence. "Your property ends at the fence. Everything beyond the fence is HOA common element." We checked the maps. "Which maps?" Arthur asked. "The landscaping maps from the developer. We have them in the clubhouse." Arthur took a slow breath. Landscaping maps. Pretty drawings made by architects to sell houses with zero legal standing regarding boundaries. Brenda, listen to me very carefully, Arthur said. This fence was built by Henderson in 2005. He set it back 15 feet from the rear property line because of a drainage swale he didn't want the dogs to dig in. My property line doesn't end at this fence. It ends 20 feet into those woods. You are currently trespassing, and you are destroying my trees. Brenda's smile vanished, replaced by the look she usually reserved for people who left their trash cans out past 6 p.m. on Tuesdays. That is ridiculous, she snapped. The fence is the boundary. It's been that way for 10 years. This is HOA land, and we have a permit. You have a permit to build on HOA land, Arthur corrected. Not on my land. I'm asking you to stop the machine. I have the certified survey in my safe. I can bring it out in 5 minutes. Brenda checked her Apple Watch. I don't have time for this, Arthur. The contractors are on an hourly rate. If you have an issue, you can bring it up at the monthly meeting in 2 weeks. Until then, stay behind your fence and let us improve the neighborhood. She turned her back on him. Okay, Mike, keep going. We need this cleared by noon. The skid steer roared back to life. Arthur stood there for a moment, watching the metal bucket tear into the earth. A large root snapped with a sound like a gunshot. He turned around and walked back toward his house. Most men would be furious. Arthur wasn't furious. He was calculating. He knew exactly what the hourly rate for a forensic survey crew was, and he knew exactly how much it cost to rip up reinforced concrete. He entered his kitchen, picked up his coffee, and walked into his study. He opened his laptop and created a new folder. He named it Case Vance versus HOA Encroachment. Then he opened the blinds so the camera mounted on his rear eave could get a clear 4K resolution view of every single shovel of dirt they stole. Go ahead, Brenda, he whispered to the empty room. Dig deep. The Oak Creek Community Clubhouse always smelled of lemon floor cleaner and stale popcorn. It was a smell that Arthur associated with petty grievances and arguments about trash can visibility. Tonight, however, the room was buzzing with a different energy. About 50 residents filled the folding metal chairs. At the front of the room, seated behind a long plastic table, sat the 5 board members. In the center was Brenda, radiating the confidence of a monarch addressing her subjects. Behind her, projected onto a pull-down screen, was a colorful, artist-rendered concept image of the Oak Creek Zen Path. It looked beautiful on the screen. There were digital people walking dogs, a digital sun setting over the pond, and a very expensive-looking digital pergola. The crowd murmured appreciatively. Arthur sat in the back row, a solitary figure in a flannel shirt and work boots, holding a thin manila folder. He wasn't there to make friends. He was there to satisfy the legal requirement of good faith effort before taking the nuclear option. And so, Brenda announced into the microphone, her voice echoing slightly, Phase 1 has officially begun. By next month, we will have the stamped concrete poured. We are using the reserve funds, yes, but the increase in our home values will pay it back tenfold. Applause rippled through the room. Arthur checked his watch. 7:45 p.m. Now, Brenda said, taking a sip of water. We move to the open forum. 3 minutes per speaker. Please state your name and address. Arthur stood up. The metal chair scraped loudly against the linoleum. Heads turned. He walked to the microphone stand in the center aisle. He placed his manila folder on the small podium. Arthur Vance, 1402 Oakwood Drive. Brenda sighed audibly into her mic. Arthur, we discussed this yesterday. If this is about the noise. It is not about the noise, Arthur interrupted, his voice calm and level. It is about the location. Yesterday, I told you that the construction crew is trespassing on my private property. You claim the land belongs to the HOA based on a landscaping concept map. He opened his folder and pulled out a large, folded document. It was old, the paper slightly yellowed, but the stamps were crisp and blue. This is the recorded plat map from the county assessor's office, dated 1998, Arthur said, holding it up. And this, he pulled out a second document, is the meets and bounds description from my deed. It clearly states that my rear property line extends 35 feet from the rear foundation of my home. The fence is only at 15 feet. Your Zen path is currently being dug 10 feet inside my legal boundary. The room went quiet. The other board members, a nervous treasurer named Steve, and a young secretary who was mostly on her phone, looked at Brenda. Brenda didn't look at the map. She looked at the audience, offering a sympathetic smile. "Arthur," she said, using a tone one might use with a confused toddler. "We have already reviewed this with the developer's original files. The fence line has been the established boundary for nearly 20 years. This is a common tactic called adverse possession, if you want to get technical. You haven't maintained that land, the HOA has. Adverse possession requires open and hostile occupation for 20 years, Arthur countered immediately. The HOA has never maintained those woods. I have. I clear the deadfall every autumn. I have receipts for tree surgery from 2012 and 2018. He stepped forward, extending the map toward the table. I am asking the board to pause construction for 48 hours. Review this survey. If I am wrong, I will pay for the delay. But if you pour concrete on my land, you are committing a permanent trespass. Brenda leaned back, crossing her arms. She didn't take the paper. We are not pausing a $40,000 contract because you found an old piece of paper, Arthur. We are on a tight schedule. I am trying to save you money, Brenda, Arthur said, his voice hardening. You are trying to obstruct a community improvement because you don't like change, Brenda shot back. She tapped her watch. Your 3 minutes are up. I haven't finished, Arthur said. Steve, cut the mic, Brenda ordered. A sharp screech of feedback tore through the speakers, and then the microphone went dead. Arthur stood there in the silence. He looked at Steve, who refused to make eye contact. He looked at Brenda, who was already shuffling papers for the next agenda item. Next speaker, please, Brenda called out, looking past Arthur. Arthur slowly closed his folder. He didn't slam it. He didn't shout profanities. He simply nodded once, as if confirming a measurement. Have it your way, he said. The room was silent enough that his unamplified voice carried clearly to the front table. He turned and walked out of the clubhouse. As he pushed through the double doors into the cool night air, he could hear Brenda's voice through the wall. Some people just can't see the big picture. Arthur walked to his truck. He took his phone out and dialed a number he hadn't called in 2 years. It was a contact saved as Miller & Sons. Geomatics. Jim, Arthur said when the line clicked open. It's Arthur Vance. I need a favor. I need a full forensic boundary survey, Class A precision, and I need you to locate every single iron pin. Yes, it's going to be a dispute. He started the engine. The diplomacy phase was over. 2 days after the disastrous meeting, the construction crew arrived at 7 a.m. sharp to pour the gravel base. The noise was deafening, the grinding of stone against steel, the beep of reversing trucks, and the shouting of the foreman. Arthur watched them from his kitchen window, sipping his coffee. He didn't look angry. He looked like a predator watching a very slow, very stupid herd of deer walking into a ravine. He finished his cup, rinsed it, and went to the garage. He bypassed his gardening tools and went straight to a locked vertical cabinet in the corner. From it, he pulled out a long yellow instrument that looked like a futuristic metal detector. It was a Schoenstedt GA52CX magnetic locator, a tool that could detect the magnetic field of a ferrous object buried 10 feet underground. It was the surveyor's Excalibur. He also grabbed a sharpshooter shovel, a 100-foot fiberglass tape measure, and a bundle of bright pink flagging tape. Arthur walked out the back door. The construction crew was busy leveling the ground about 25 feet past his chain link fence. The foreman, a man named Russo, spotted Arthur coming out but just rolled his eyes and turned back to his clipboard. They expected him to yell. Arthur didn't even look at them. He walked to the front corner of his lot, near the street, a spot far removed from the construction. He turned the Schoenstedt on. The machine emitted a low, static hum. He swept it over the grass near the curb. Ree-oo. The pitch spiked instantly. Arthur knelt, dug a small plug of sod, and revealed the rusty top of a number 4 rebar rod with a yellow plastic cap. Corner one, he muttered. He hooked his tape measure to the rod and began to walk toward the backyard, feeding the line out. He walked past the side of his house, past his patio, and straight to the chain link fence. He climbed over the fence. Hey, buddy, Russo shouted, stepping over a pile of crushed stone. You can't be back here. This is an active work zone. Arthur ignored him. He was counting his steps. He checked the tape measure. He was at the 120-foot mark, which was exactly where the fence stood. According to his deed, the property line was at 140 feet. He kept walking into the construction zone. "Hey!" Russo dropped his clipboard and jogged over. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. Ms. Miller told us you might try to cause trouble. I don't want to call the cops." Arthur stopped at the 140-foot mark. He was standing right in the middle of where they had just graded the earth for the path. The raw dirt was soft under his boots. "You don't need to call the cops," Arthur said, his voice flat. "I'm just checking for my sprinkler lines." It was a lie, but it was a boring enough lie that Russo hesitated. "Make it quick. We're pouring gravel in an hour." Arthur turned the Schoenstedt back on. He swept the tip over the graded dirt. Nothing. He moved 6 inches to the left. Nothing. He moved a foot to the right, sweeping slowly. "Ree!" the machine screamed. The signal was strong, sharp, and unmistakable. Arthur drove his shovel into the earth. The dirt here had been scraped by the bulldozers, so he only had to go down about 4 inches. Clink. Metal on metal. Arthur got on his knees and brushed the loose soil away. There it was. An old, thick iron pipe flared at the top, a classic property monument used in the late 80s. It was solid, immovable, and absolutely defining. He took a rag from his pocket and wiped the top of the pipe. He could see the faint indentation of the surveyor's license number stamped into the metal. Arthur looked up. The iron pipe was 5 feet beyond the far edge of the new path. This meant the entire project, the path, the drainage, the future pergola, wasn't just encroaching. It was sitting 100% inside Arthur's property. The HOA wasn't building near his land, they were building on it. He tied a piece of pink flagging tape around the top of the pipe, then took his phone out. He snapped a photo of the pipe, then a photo of the pipe with the tape measure stretching back to his house, and finally a wide shot showing the pipe in relation to the construction equipment. "Found it," Arthur said, standing up. "Found vice sprinkler?" Russo asked, looking bored. "Something like that," Arthur said. He kicked the dirt back over the hole, burying the pipe in the pink ribbon completely. "You're all good," Arthur said to Russo. "Sorry for the interruption. You boys keep working. Don't let me stop you." Arthur climbed back over his fence, winding up his tape measure. His heart was hammering a slow, heavy rhythm of triumph. He had just confirmed that Brenda Miller was spending $40,000 of the community's money to improve Arthur Vance's private backyard. He walked into his house and went straight to the calendar on the wall. He counted the days. The concrete pour was scheduled for Friday. He would wait. He would let the concrete set. In the eyes of the law, the more permanent the structure, the more egregious the trespass. He picked up the phone to call Jim at Miller & Sons Geomatics again. "Jim," Arthur said, "change of plans. Don't come out tomorrow. Come out next Monday. I want them to finish the paving first. I want the survey to show the completed encroachment." He hung up and watched the crew dump a load of gravel onto his land. "Build it nice," he whispered. The cement trucks arrived on Friday morning, massive rotating drums that shook the pavement of the cul-de-sac. For the neighbors watching from their windows, the arrival of the concrete signified progress. For Brenda Miller, it signified victory. But for Arthur Vance, standing behind his sliding glass door with a steaming mug of Earl Grey, it signified the point of no return. Once concrete is poured, mistake becomes negligence. Once it cures, negligence becomes damages. Arthur had spent the last 3 days being invisible. He didn't go out to the fence. He didn't call the property management company. He didn't even glare at the workers. To the outside world, he was a beaten man, an old retiree who had realized the futility of fighting the Homeowners Association. This silence was the most dangerous weapon in his arsenal. By noon, the forms were filled. The crew used texturing stamps to give the wet concrete the look of natural slate, an upgrade Brenda had insisted on at the last minute. It cost an extra $3 per square foot. Arthur made a note of that in his logbook, right next to the timestamp of the pour. On Saturday, the carpentry crew arrived. They weren't using pressure-treated pine, the standard lumber for outdoor projects. They were unloading massive beams of western red cedar. Arthur zoomed in with his Nikon. The wood was gorgeous. It was rot-resistant, aromatic, and incredibly expensive. He watched as they erected the posts for the pergola, drilling into the fresh concrete footings. Brenda appeared around 2 p.m. to inspect the work. She was wearing a white hard hat that looked ridiculous on her, paired with a floral blouse. She walked the length of the path, Arthur's path, running her hand along the smooth cedar beams. She looked toward Arthur's house. He knew she couldn't see him through the glare of the glass, but he saw her smirk. She said something to the foreman, gestured to Arthur's old chain-link fence, and laughed. Arthur didn't flinch. He simply turned the page of his ledger. Item: unauthorized construction of permanent structure. Western red cedar pergola. Estimated material cost, $12,000. Labor, $8,000. He checked the HOA's most recent financial newsletter, which he had saved on his tablet. The reserve fund, the money set aside for emergencies like storm damage or roof repairs, sat at roughly $65,000. Brenda was currently burning through nearly 2/3 of the community's safety net on a vanity project built on stolen land. By Sunday evening, the project was complete. The Zen path wound elegantly through the trees, a ribbon of stamped stone leading to a majestic pergola overlooking the retention pond. Solar-powered lights had been installed along the edges, casting a soft amber glow as the sun went down. It was undeniably beautiful. It was also undeniably illegal. Arthur walked out onto his patio as twilight settled. The construction crew was gone. The heavy machinery had been hauled away. The silence of the suburbs had returned, but now it was punctuated by the soft hum of the new path lights. He walked down to his fence. The gap between his fence and the new path was less than 5 feet. He could smell the cedar. He could see the fresh mulch they had spread over the roots of his oaks, mulch that would likely rot the bark if not removed. A neighbor, a young man named David from 3 houses down, was testing out the path with his golden retriever. He saw Arthur at the fence. "Looks great, doesn't it, Art?" David called out, genuinely friendly. "Brenda really pulled this one off. Adds a lot of class to the neighborhood." Arthur smiled. It was a genuine smile, though not for the reason David thought. "It certainly is a substantial improvement, David," Arthur replied. "Very substantial." David waved and jogged on. Arthur turned back to his house. The trap was set. The bait had been taken. The jaws were ready to snap shut. He picked up his phone and sent a single text message to Jim at Miller & Sons Geomatics. "Construction complete. Site is clear. You are green for tomorrow at 0800. He went inside and locked the door. The waiting was over. Tomorrow the measuring would begin in earnest, and every inch would cost Brenda Miller her reputation. At 8 a.m. on Monday, a white Ford F-250 with Miller & Sons Geomatics stenciled on the door pulled into Arthur's driveway. Jim Miller was a man who spoke in coordinates and elevations. He shook Arthur's hand, unloaded a robotic total station, a high-precision optical instrument used for modern surveying, and a set of prism poles. There was no guesswork involved in Jim's trade. There was only data. "Show me what we're looking at, Art," Jim said, adjusting his vest. Arthur led him to the backyard. Jim whistled low and long when he saw the new path in the cedar pergola. "Fancy," Jim noted. "Did they pull a permit for this?" "They did," Arthur replied, "based on a landscape architect's doodle." Jim shook his head. "Amateurs." For the next 4 hours, the backyard became a crime scene of geometry. Jim set up his tripod over the street monument, establishing a control point. He then moved systematically through the property, shooting lasers at the prism pole held by his assistant. They located the iron pins Arthur had found, plus 2 others deep in the brush that even Arthur had missed. Around 11 a.m., a silver Lexus slowed to a crawl in front of the house. Brenda Miller's window rolled down. Arthur was standing by the curb while Jim packed up the tripod. Brenda looked at the survey equipment, then at Arthur. Her expression was one of smug victory. "Getting your boundaries checked for a new fence, Arthur?" she called out. "I told you that old chain link was an eyesore. I'm glad you're finally taking the initiative to upgrade it." She assumed the survey was for his benefit, that he was preparing to build a new fence on the line she had dictated. She couldn't conceive that the survey was actually an indictment of her own project. Arthur didn't correct her. "Just making sure everything is where it should be, Brenda." "Good. Oh, yeah, they said, checking her reflection in the rearview mirror. Make sure you submit the architectural request form before you build. We don't want any delays. She drove off, waving a hand dismissively. Jim watched her go. That the president? That's her, Arthur said. She has no idea she just bought you a $40,000 patio, does she? Not a clue, Arthur said. Well, Jim said, pulling a tablet out of the truck. Here's the preliminary data. The red line is your deeded boundary. The blue hatch is the encroachment. He turned the screen. The diagram showed the winding path and the entire square footage of the pergola sitting comfortably inside the red box of Arthur's lot. The pergola is 12 feet inside your line, Jim stated professionally. The path runs across your property for a length of 86 feet. Total encroached area is roughly 2,000 square feet. In my professional opinion, this isn't an encroachment. This is an annexation. Write it up, Arthur said. I need the stamped plans by Thursday, and send the bill to my lawyer. Arthur spent the afternoon in the office of Robert Katz, a real estate attorney who specialized in property disputes. Katz was a shark who wore suspenders and smelled faintly of cigar smoke. He reviewed the photos, the deed, and Jim's preliminary data. It's textbook, Katz said, leaning back. Trespass to real property. Malicious destruction of vegetation. Unjust enrichment. We can file for a mandatory injunction to remove the structure. Not yet, Arthur said. Katz raised an eyebrow. Why wait? I checked the HOA board minutes this morning, Arthur explained. The final invoice from the contractor was approved for payment last night, but the check hasn't cleared yet. I want the money to leave their account. I want them to be fully invested. If we stop them now, they might be able to negotiate a partial refund from the contractor. I want the transaction complete. You want them to feel the burn, Katz said, a small smile appearing. They sent out invitations for the grand opening ribbon cutting next Saturday, Arthur said. They invited the mayor. Katz chuckled. You want to serve them at the party? I want the process server to hand Brenda the lawsuit while she's holding the scissors, Arthur said coldly. I want there to be absolutely no doubt about who owns that land when the photo is taken. Katz tapped his pen on the desk. Ruthless. I like it. I'll have the papers drawn up. We'll file Friday afternoon just before the courts close. That way they can't get a judge on the phone until Monday. By then, the party will be over. Arthur stood up and shook the lawyer's hand. He drove home, parking in his driveway as the sun set over the neighborhood. He walked to his backyard and looked at the pergola one last time. It really was a nice structure. It was a shame it had to go. But as Arthur knew better than anyone, lines on a map were the only things that mattered. And Brenda had just crossed all of them. Saturday arrived with the sky so blue it looked artificial, a perfect backdrop for what Brenda Miller considered her coronation. By 10:02 a.m., the cul-de-sac was lined with cars. The HOA had spared no expense. There was a catering table set up on the common grass, safely away from the proper fine, laden with sparkling cider and finger sandwiches. A bouquet of red, white, and blue balloons bobbed in the breeze, tied to the posts of the newly finished cedar pergola. Arthur Vance stood on his back deck. He was dressed in a clean polo shirt and slacks, looking for all the world like a man ready to inaugurate a pleasant weekend. He held a pair of binoculars, though he didn't raise them. He didn't need to. The spectacle was unfolding less than 50 feet away. Brenda was in her element. She wore a tailored pantsuit and a name tag that read President in bold letters. She flitted between groups of neighbors, accepting compliments and pointing out the details of the stamped concrete. Standing next to her was Mayor Galloway. The mayor was a man who would attend the opening of an envelope if there was a chance for a photo op. He was shaking hands, laughing, and admiring the community initiative. Arthur checked his watch, 10:13 a.m. Right on time, he murmured. A gray sedan, nondescript and dusty, turned into the cul-de-sac. It navigated through the parked cars and stopped near Arthur's driveway. A man stepped out. He was thick-set, wearing a cheap suit that was slightly too tight across the shoulders. He carried a thick envelope. This was not a guest. This was a process server named Frank, and he had been instructed to serve the defendant personally. Down by the pergola, Brenda clapped her hands for attention. A hush fell over the crowd of about 30 residents. If I could have everyone's attention, Brenda beamed, her voice projecting clearly. She stood directly under the cedar beams, holding a pair of oversized ceremonial scissors. The red ribbon was stretched taut across the entrance to the path, Arthur's path. This project has been a labor of love, Brenda began, her eyes glistening with performed emotion. Despite the resistance from some conservative voices in our community who fear progress, the board has persevered. We have created a space for peace, for nature, and for property value. The crowd applauded politely. The mayor nodded sagely. And so, Brenda continued, opening the giant scissors, it is my honor to officially open the Oak Creek Zen path. She positioned the blades around the ribbon. The cameras were raised. Excuse me, Ms. Miller? The voice was flat, loud, and completely devoid of festivity. Brenda froze. She looked up. Frank was walking down the slope of the lawn, stepping right onto the new concrete. He walked with the heavy, purposeful gait of a man who got paid by the delivery. I'm in the middle of a speech, Brenda hissed, her smile tight. Who are you? Frank didn't stop until he was 3 feet away from her, right in the frame of the mayor's photo op. Are you Brenda Miller, president of the Oak Creek Homeowners Association? Frank asked. Yes, obviously, Brenda snapped. Now, if you could please step aside. Brenda Miller, you are served, Frank said. He thrust the thick envelope into her free hand, the one not holding the scissors. What is this? Brenda looked down, confused. Summons and complaint, Frank announced, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. And a temporary restraining order signed by Judge Holloway this morning. All construction, usage, and access to this structure is hereby halted immediately pending the hearing for trespass, malicious destruction of property, and conversion. The silence that followed was absolute. A balloon popped somewhere in the distance, sounding like a gunshot. Brenda stared at the packet. The cover sheet was unmistakable. Vance versus Oak Creek HOA et al. This is ridiculous, Brenda stammered, her face flushing a deep, blotchy red. She looked at the mayor for support. The mayor, sensing the radioactive nature of a lawsuit, had already taken 2 subtle steps backward. I actually have a council meeting, he muttered, signaling his aide. He evaporated from the scene with impressive speed. You can't do this, Brenda shouted at Frank's retreating back. We have a permit. We have the mayor. Frank didn't look back. He just got in his gray sedan and drove away. The neighbors began to whisper. They looked at the beautiful path, then at the legal documents shaking in Brenda's hand, and finally eyes started turning toward the house on the hill. Arthur was standing at his railing. He caught Brenda's eye. She looked up at him, her face twisted in shock and fury. Arthur didn't wave. He didn't gloat. He simply took a sip of his coffee, turned his back, and walked inside, sliding the glass door shut with a decisive click. The ribbon remained uncut. The party was over. The Honorable Judge Marcus Holloway was a man who had spent 30 years in real estate law before taking the bench. He had zero patience for theatrics, and even less for people who couldn't read a deed. Courtroom 4B was quiet, save for the hum of the HVAC system and the rustling of paper. On the plaintiff's side, Arthur sat next to Robert Katz. Their table was neat, organized with 3 distinct binders: deed, survey, and damages. On the defense side, Brenda Miller sat next to the HOA's retained counsel, a harried-looking man named Mr. Henderson. Their table was a mess of loose papers and rolled-up architectural drawings that looked more like marketing posters than legal exhibits. Mr. Henderson, Judge Holloway said, looking over his reading glasses, I have read the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment regarding the trespass. Do you have a defense that doesn't rely on... He paused, looking at a document in his hand. Vibes-based understanding of the boundary line? Mr. Henderson stood up, buttoning his jacket. Your Honor, the Homeowners Association acted in good faith. For nearly 2 decades, the chain-link fence was treated as the de facto boundary. We argue that through the doctrine of acquiescence, the property line had shifted. Acquiescence requires mutual recognition over a specific period, usually involving uncertainty about the true line, the judge countered immediately. Is there uncertainty about the true line, Mr. Katz? Arthur's lawyer stood up. He didn't speak. He simply placed a large, rigid board on the easel facing the bench. It was the forensic survey Jim Miller had produced. It showed the stark black lines of the legal lot and the bright red overlay of the HOA's new construction. The Zen path didn't just clip the corner of Arthur's bun, it severed it. The pergola sat unmistakably, mockingly, right in the middle of Arthur's private property. "Your Honor," Kat said smoothly, "this is a Class A certified boundary survey, recorded last week. It locates the original iron monument set in 1990. My client's deed is specific. The HOA's deed is specific. There is no ambiguity here." The defendant simply didn't bother to check. The judge stared at the board. He looked at the red blob of the pergola. He looked at the black line of the boundary. "Ms. Miller," the judge said, shifting his gaze to the HOA president. Brenda jumped slightly. "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you order a survey before you authorized $40,000 of construction?" Brenda stood up, ignoring her lawyer's hand trying to pull her down. "We didn't need one. We had the developer's landscape plan. It clearly showed the common area extending to the fence. Mr. Vance is just trying to capitalize on a technicality to ruin a community improvement." The judge rubbed his temples. "A technicality?" "Ms. Miller, in property law, a technicality is what we call ownership. The landscape plan is a marketing brochure bomb. It has the legal weight of a napkin." He turned back to the HOA lawyer. "Mr. Henderson, your client built a permanent structure on land they do not own. They destroyed mature trees on land they do not own. And they did so after being verbally warned by the property owner." "We dispute the value of the trees," Henderson tried weakly. "That is a matter for the damages hearing," the judge cut him off. "But on the matter of the trespass, there is no dispute." The judge picked up his gavel. The sound of wood hitting wood was soft, but it echoed with the weight of finality. "I am granting the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment on the count of trespass to real property. I am also granting the permanent injunction. The Oak Creek HOA is hereby ordered to cease all use of the path immediately." Brenda looked like she had been slapped. "But we spent the reserve funds. We can't just close it." The judge looked at her with eyes like flint. "Oh, you aren't just closing it, Ms. Miller. You are removing it. I am ordering the structure to be demolished and the land restored to its original grade and condition within 30 days. If you fail to do so, I will authorize Mr. Vance to hire a contractor to do it, and the court will garnish the HOA's bank accounts to pay for it." "Restored?" Brenda whispered, her face draining of color. "That will cost. It will cost a fortune," Arthur thought, watching her unravel. "Court is adjourned," the judge said. Arthur didn't smile. He didn't look at Brenda. He simply packed his binders into his briefcase. As he walked past the defense table, he heard Brenda frantically whispering to her lawyer, "Does insurance cover this?" "No," the lawyer replied, his voice tired. "Intentional torts are not covered. This comes out of the budget, or a special assessment." Arthur walked out of the double doors. The law had spoken. Now came the demolition. The letter arrived in every mailbox in Oak Creek on a rainy Tuesday. It was on heavy bond paper, stamped with the HOA seal, but the content was anything but prestigious. It was a notice of a special assessment. Due to unforeseen legal liabilities and mandated property restoration, the reserve fund was depleted. To cover the court-ordered demolition, the legal fees for both sides, and the restoration of Arthur Vance's land, every household was being billed $3,200. That was the moment Brenda Miller's reign ended. It didn't end with a vote, it ended with a riot. The emergency meeting held the following night was standing room only. There were no PowerPoint presentations this time, and no catered sandwiches. There was only shouting. When Brenda tried to take the podium to explain that she was victim blamed by a litigious resident, she was booed off the stage. The vote to recall the entire board was unanimous. Brenda was stripped of her title, her keys to the clubhouse, and her dignity. She left the meeting in tears, but there was no sympathy in the room. She had cost her neighbors $3,000 each because she refused to look at a map. 2 weeks later, the heavy machinery returned to Arthur's backyard. It was a different crew this time, a specialized demolition team hired by the court-appointed receiver who was now managing the HOA's finances. Arthur stood on his patio, the same mug of coffee in his hand, watching the reverse of the process that had started the nightmare. The beautiful western red cedar pergola, which had stood for less than a month, was the first to go. A worker with a chainsaw sliced through the pristine beams. The wood groaned as it collapsed into a pile of expensive scrap. It was a tragic waste of materials, Arthur thought, but a necessary sacrifice for the principle of ownership. Next came the jackhammers. The stamped concrete path, the Zen walk that Brenda had been so proud of, was pulverized into gray dust. The noise was terrible, but to Arthur, it sounded like order being restored. They hauled the debris away in 3 massive dump trucks. Then the landscaping crew arrived. Per the judge's specific instructions, they didn't just fill the hole with dirt. They had to restore the biotic condition of the land. This meant trucking in premium topsoil and planting 4 semi-mature white oak trees to replace the ones Brenda had destroyed. The cost of the trees alone was more than the original concrete path. By Friday afternoon, the work was done. The machines were gone, the noise had faded. Arthur walked down to his backyard. The ground was raw and smelled of fresh mulch. But the trees were there. The invasive path was gone. He walked past the old chain-link fence line, stepping comfortably onto the land that had been fought over. He paced out the 35 feet to the true property line, where Jim Miller had set fresh, bright orange stakes. Tomorrow, Arthur said to himself, we build the new fence right here. He turned back to look at his house. Through the trees, he could see the back of Brenda's house 2 streets over. The lights were off. A for sale sign had appeared in her yard that morning. Arthur took a deep breath. The air smelled of pine, rain, and soil. It was his air, on his land, protected by his law. He walked back up the hill, entered his home, and locked the door. The case was closed.